Hey there. Tonight we're going somewhere loud, smoky, and forgotten by the law. A medieval casino, though no one called it that. Just a back room, a dice table, and too much to lose. No velvet, no rules, no mercy. Only coin, risk, and the kind of men who laugh when they bleed. It wasn't built for fun. It was built to strip hope down to its last copper. You won by cheating or praying. You lost by blinking. And someone always lost. So dim the light, steady your breath, and step into a place that never forgives. There is no sign that says casino. No carved wooden letters. No swinging painted board. Just a crooked doorway leaning into the alley, half swallowed by the wall itself. The wood around it is soft with rot, the stone blackened with age, soot, and things no one names. If there's a smell, it's not the sour tang of spilled beer or even the heavy reek of sweat. It's older than that, something deep in the timber, like breath that's been held too long. Most who pass by never notice the entrance. Those who do don't stop. And those who stop are already halfway inside before their minds catch up. There is no welcome, no lantern, no invitation. Only the kind of silence that feels like a dare. And behind the door, noise. Low, thick, and constant, a hum made of coin, cup, and consequence. These places don't exist on maps. No one builds them, they just grow. Behind butcher stalls, under inns, in burned-out corners of the city that never healed. Some are nothing more than a table and 3 chairs. Others sprawl beneath ground level, dug out like graves, with stone walls weeping in the dark. There are no clocks, no windows, no names. The people who run them change every month. The furniture never does. And if a roof caves in or a wall burns, another door opens somewhere else. Not because someone built it, but because something needed space to feed. What they have in common is this: no rules posted, no gods welcome, and no debt forgiven. The house has no face, but its memory lives in bruises, in scratches, in missing shoes. It offers nothing, only a place where people come to lose. There is no pretense. This isn't a tavern, though drink is poured. This isn't a brothel, though bodies are sold. This isn't a court, though judgment falls. It is something meaner, simpler. A room for men, simple, and sometimes women who believe that luck can be bent if stared at hard enough. The light is low because no one wants to see clearly. The floor is sticky with old things. The air hums with heat even in winter, crowded tight with breath and friction. Wooden boards don't creak. They groan. The ceiling is too low, as if the room itself is ashamed. No one speaks freely here. Voices are pitched for the table, never for the room. The only truth is the clatter of dice and the scrape of a coin pushed forward. Everything else is bait. Outside, these places are invisible. Inside, they are unforgettable. A man may forget his wedding night, his first wage, even his own child's face, but not the way the air felt the first time he stepped into a place like this. He may not return for years, but it stays under his nails, in his teeth, in the twitch of his fingers when he hears bone on wood. Some say it's the devil's work. Others say it's no more evil than farming, just faster. But no one argues that it changes people. Even those who win don't walk out the same. Something stays behind. Something always stays. And the place itself? It doesn't care. The building doesn't know your name. It only knows the sound of a door closing behind someone who should have kept walking. There is no natural light, no windows, no slits in the walls, no hope of seeing the sky from inside. Even during midday, when the streets outside are flooded with sun and the dust glows in alleyways like gold, the room stays dark. Not dim, dark. Candles are few, torches fewer. Lamps burn low when they burn at all. The shadows don't fall where they should. They lean in strange directions, stretching over the tables like fingers. This isn't an accident. It's design. Not for comfort, not for mystery, but for concealment. In darkness, a man can lose without shame. He can curse the dice, curse the dealer, curse the gods, and no one has to watch his face collapse. The gloom swallows everything. Fear, greed, regret. No one sees a man cry here, not because it doesn't happen, but because no one wants to. The darkness blurs identity. It's hard to say who is who or what anyone owes. Eyes adjust to outlines, not expressions. Faces disappear into the walls. Voices flatten into noise. A new player sits down and no one asks his name. An old one slumps forward and no one notices. The dimness makes space for everything that should be hidden. Trembling hands, clenched jaws, the slick edge of a blade in a boot. There's something about the dark that forgives dishonesty. It gives shelter to cheats and comfort to those too ashamed to admit they'll play again tomorrow. And it makes memory unreliable. Details fade faster in the half-light. Who accused whom? What was bet? When it all went wrong. The lack of light means the house can't be blamed. The room becomes a void, and inside that void, anything is possible. Especially the things no one wants to admit. The air itself feels thick with shadow. Smoke clings to the rafters, clots in the corners, pools like fog just above the tables. It's a smoke made not only of fire, but of breath, grease, hair, old wool, and secrets. It dulls the senses, softens the edges of movement and sound. Sometimes a chair falls over and no one flinches. Sometimes a man is punched and no one reacts. The darkness makes every act smaller, as if nothing here quite counts. It makes cruelty quieter, too. A shove becomes a nudge. A threat becomes a whisper. And when something worse happens, a scream, a collapse, a debt collected too harshly, the shadows press in and muffle it like cloth. People look away because looking would mean accepting they saw it. It's easier not to see. And in this place, easy is everything. There is one candle near the entrance, not for warmth, not for sight, but as a warning. Its weak flame flickers just enough to show the way down, but not enough to illuminate what waits below. It marks the end of the outside world and the beginning of something deeper, something unlit by reason or remorse. Once inside, no one expects to see clearly. They expect to feel, to risk, to drown. Light would ruin the illusion that nothing matters, that time has stopped, that consequences wait elsewhere. So it stays dark, always. Not because there's nothing to see, but because there's too much. The tables are never even. Their legs are mismatched, patched with splinters and rope, jammed with rocks or folded parchment to stop the wobble, which never really stops. One corner always sags, one side always tilts. If you press your elbow too hard, the whole surface shifts, as if recoiling from your presence. The wood itself is swollen in places and worn thin in others, stained not just with drink but with time, the kind of time that seeps into grain and never leaves. Coins clatter unevenly, rolling toward the dip, gathering in the warped middle like regrets pooling in a life poorly lived. When the dice bounce, they bounce crooked, and no one trusts where they land. But everyone pretends, because the table is the only authority here. It's not level, it's not fair, but it's what they have, and that's enough to keep playing. Some of the grooves in the wood are just wear from years of play. Others are knife marks, carved deep and without subtlety. People dig names, debts, curses, even prayers into the surface, not for remembrance but for proof. Proof that they were here, that they risked something, that something mattered, even if just for a moment. Resin has collected in the cracks, mixing with dried beer and the occasional drop of something redder. The surface sticks to your skin if you stay too long. It smells of old heat, old anger. The grain catches your knuckles when you lean forward in desperation. And when the game is over, if there ever was one, you pull away with the faint outline of the table still on your flesh. These tables brand everyone, not visibly, but permanently. No one leaves without taking a piece of the surface home, even if it's only under their fingernails. The chairs fare no better. They groan when sat on, squeal when moved, and collapse without warning. Few match. Most are missing a rung or two. Some are just overturned crates. Some are benches meant for other things. But no one complains. Comfort was never part of the promise. The instability becomes part of the ritual. A reminder that nothing is secure. Not your footing, not your wager, not your place in the room. And when someone loses badly, it's often the chair that moves first. A sudden lurch, a crash, a toppled man on the floor before he realizes it was over. People laugh, or don't. Someone may offer a hand, but more often, the space closes in and the game continues. Because the table doesn't wait. It never has. And no matter how tilted it gets, someone's always leaning forward, still hoping to change their luck by force of will alone. Hope here is measured in small things. The way a coin lands, the sound of a roll, the absence of groaning when a bet is placed. The table listens to every movement, every lie, every prayer muttered through clenched teeth. It doesn't answer, but it holds the weight of those hopes, stacked unevenly on its crooked surface. Some nights, the table is kinder. Other nights, it seems to buckle under the burden of what people want from it. And when a game ends, if it ends, the table doesn't remember who won or how. It just stands there, leaning the same way, catching the same light, waiting for the next pair of shaking hands to place something precious in its center. It never promises anything, but it receives everything. The last coin, the last breath, the last thing that made sense. And still, it wobbles. There were no grand strategies here, no elaborate rules, no carefully weighed odds, no elegance. Just games stripped down to their bones, quick, brutal, and built for loss. The most common involved dice, carved roughly from bone or wood, often chipped, sometimes loaded. They tumbled across the table with an uneven clatter, their movement unpredictable, their outcome final. A man would throw once, twice, sometimes 3 times, and then his coin would be gone, or doubled, or challenged. The simplicity was the point. Anyone could play. No education required, no training, no preparation. Only 2 things mattered: the coin in your hand and the nerve to risk it. Even those watching barely followed the mechanics. They watched the faces, the hands, the posture. Because in games like these, it wasn't the outcome that mattered. It was the collapse that followed. Some games used coins, one side marked, the other not, flipped in darkness and slapped to the back of the hand. Wagers were made before the toss, then arguments began immediately after. Whether the call was right or wrong often depended less on the result and more on who was bigger, louder, or faster with a knife. There were games with cups and small stones, guessing which hand held the weight. There were games that involved drawing lots from a bag, one red, the rest black, where the unlucky token meant your debt doubled. But no matter the rules, luck ruled everything. Skill was a rumor, logic a lie. Memory didn't help. Pattern recognition got you killed. The house didn't need to cheat. The games were already built to ruin the player. They offered no advantage, no learning curve, just the illusion that trying again might be different. No one kept score. Winning didn't last. A lucky streak might buy you drinks for an hour, or earn you a few uneasy glances. But there was no path to anything better. This wasn't a ladder, just a loop. What rose quickly fell faster. People played for silver, for pride, for nothing at all. Some played because they didn't know how to stop. Others because they didn't know where else to go. And a few, the most dangerous, played because they liked what came after the game. The argument, the escalation, the excuse to reach for something sharp. In this room, luck was both weapon and wound. It turned friends into enemies, strangers into threats, silence into something dense and heavy. Even when no one was playing, the air carried the rhythm of chance, quickening, tightening, always ready to punish the hopeful. The games were short. That was their cruelty. A single toss could end an hour's worth of breath-holding. A moment's hesitation could cost a week's food. There were no long cons, no careful plays, just a handful of seconds that changed everything, or nothing. And the players knew this. That was why they kept coming back. Because somewhere beneath the grime and the noise and the bloodied knuckles was a flicker of belief that luck might land on their side, just once more. That even in a place built to strip you bare, you might walk out with more than you brought in. The room didn't encourage this, but it didn't need to. The games were enough, simple, sharp, pitiless, and always waiting. The dice were everywhere, small, crude, easy to make and easier to hide, carved from bone, shaped from wood, chipped from stone. Some still bore marks of the animals they came from, knuckle lines, marrow grooves, yellowed polish from too many hands. No two sets looked alike, and none of them could be trusted. Edges were shaved, dots uneven, weight shifted just enough to favor one side. But no one cared. That wasn't the point. The dice weren't instruments of fairness. They were excuses. Excuses to hope. Excuses to rage. Excuses to forget everything that had come before. The moment they hit the table, the world shrank to a single instant. The sound of bone on wood, and the silence that followed before someone breathed again. The rules changed from place to place. Some games were simple, highest roll wins. Others had layers, combinations, second throws, or chances to double down. But underneath the numbers was always violence. The dice didn't just determine the winner, they set the mood. A lucky roll meant cheers or suspicion. An unlucky one could end in shouting. A suspicious roll, repeated twice, might mean blood. Players watched the throw more than the result. Too smooth, and someone cried trickery. Too awkward, and someone cried weakness, and every accusation needed to be settled, not with proof, but with force. Fists slammed into tables, chairs scraped, voices cracked. The dice sat still between it all, innocent, blank, and waiting to be picked up again. They were small objects, but they held too much. A pair of dice could cost a man his pay, his ring, his coat, his teeth. They were easy to carry and easier to blame. Men brought them from village to village like seeds of misfortune, starting games in barns, in corners, behind markets. They rolled on dirt floors and uneven planks, in shadows and in plain view. And always, someone lost more than they meant to. In some towns, dice were outlawed, not because of gambling, but because of the violence they attracted. A stabbing was easier to clean up than a riot. But the bans never lasted. Dice didn't need permission. They passed from hand to hand like gossip, like disease, and they never stopped rolling. In the end, the danger wasn't in what the dice could do. It was in what people believed about them. That they had moods, that they could be charmed, that a certain corner of the room made them kinder, or a certain player's touch turned them mean. Superstition wrapped around them like smoke, and players leaned into it. Some whispered to the dice. Some spat before throwing. Some never touched the same pair twice. But none of it mattered. The dice weren't lucky. They were bait. And the longer you watched them tumble, the more you forgot what you'd risked. Until all that was left was a single roll, a single moment, and whatever came after, a laugh, a shove, or a knife in the dark. Money entered the room in silence and left in pieces. It came folded in cloth, hidden in boots, tucked beneath belts, clutched in trembling hands. Most of it never even touched the table. It changed shape before it changed hands, from coin to debt, from promise to laughter, from copper to bruises. The coins themselves were small, stained, unevenly cut, and often clipped, shaved just enough to cheat their weight. But no one refused them. A clipped coin still bought a place at the table, still rolled across the wood, still vanished before the hour changed. Men who spent weeks hauling barrels, digging ditches, or breaking stones handed over a month's pay before their second drink. Not because they were drunk, but because they believed, for one moment, that risk could buy escape, that luck could buy forgetting, that chance was fairer than life. The room did nothing to stop them. There were no ledgers, no warnings, no careful stewards of wealth, only men who nodded at the sight of coin and reached for the dice. The first bet was small, a test, a taste. The second came faster. By the third, the pattern was set. Coins fell quicker than sweat, piled up in the center, vanished into someone's palm, reappeared in another game. There was no memory of who had what, only the sound of metal scraping against wood, of bets being called and eyes narrowing. What started as a single silver piece often turned into everything: boots, belt, knife, ring, dignity. And still the player stayed, insisting he could win it back, that the next roll would be different, that the house wasn't watching, smiling, waiting, but the house was always watching, and it never smiled. By the end of the night, the room was full of empty hands and open mouths. Men sat where their money used to be. Some slouched forward, staring at nothing. Others stood too straight, clinging to anger to mask the hollowness inside. A few tried to leave without paying, thinking no one would notice. But someone always did. The debt collector, the doorman, the man with the crooked lip who didn't play but never blinked. Debts in this place didn't wait. They followed. They found you in alleys, at wells, in your own bed. And they didn't ask twice. Some who left without paying came back with blood on their shirts. Some didn't come back at all. But no one mourned them. In a room where money disappears like breath in winter, loss becomes routine. Grief becomes noise. And everything else, just another empty pocket turned inside out. What made it worse was how easy it was to forget. The room was built for amnesia. No clocks, no windows, no reminders. Just the warm blur of candlelight and the constant hum of chance. Even the poor believed they had enough to risk. Even the cautious believed they could stop. But once the first coin left the hand, the others followed without protest. As if the purse wanted to empty itself. As if the wages earned in mud and pain had no weight in this place. There were stories, always stories, of men who walked in with a year's savings and left barefoot. Of women who pawned their wedding rings and left in silence. Of boys who lied about their age just to join the game. But the stories didn't warn anyone. They just echoed, faint and familiar, like a lullaby played too many times. Because in the medieval casino, nothing vanishes faster than money, except maybe the memory of how much you once had. Cards were rare, not because they were expensive, though they often were, but because they were feared. Unlike dice, crude, anonymous, simple, cards carried images, faces, symbols, allegories, too many lines, too many meanings. The clergy whispered that they were devil's scripture, that the ink held curses, that the Queen of Spades was a witch in disguise. And yet they spread. Slowly, from port to port, from soldier to merchant, from tavern to brothel. Most decks were hand-painted, crude copies of crude copies. Some bore saints, some kings, some strange beasts no one could name. No two were exactly the same. No one trusted them. And still, when they appeared, the room grew quieter. Dice brought noise. Cards brought attention. A kind of hush that wasn't reverent. It was tense. Cards didn't roll. They turned. And the turn always meant something. Few knew the rules. Each town had its own. Some played tricks, others totals, others a strange game of matching and bluffing that no one could fully explain. But everyone pretended to understand. Because to admit ignorance at the card table was to admit weakness. And in a room like this, weakness drew eyes. So the players learned to nod, to smile, to throw down cards as if they knew what they were doing. The bluff became the game. The game became the mask. And behind the mask was desperation. The stakes were higher with cards, not just coin, but ego. A man could lose a fortune in dice and shrug. But a loss in cards stung differently. It felt like being outwitted, exposed, reduced, and some couldn't take that. Accusations flew. Cheating was assumed. Knives came out faster at the card table. There was something about the silence, the slow burn of the game, that made the eruption inevitable. Because of this, cards didn't last. A deck might survive one night, maybe two, before being burned, torn, or soaked in ale. Players blamed the cards themselves, cursed them for bad luck, for strange pulls, for the way the same hand kept returning again and again. Superstition clung to the decks like damp to stone. Some swore never to touch a card painted with blue ink. Others refused any deck that showed a woman without a veil. One man was said to have torn out every king from a deck after a nightmare, Another buried his cards under a crossroads to kill their power. It wasn't logic. It was ritual. And the ritual had power, even if only in the mind. Because cards were more than a game. They were a mirror. They revealed too much, not about fate, but about the people holding them. And yet, they kept returning, smuggled in saddlebags, drawn by candlelight, passed hand to hand like forbidden scripture. No one admitted to owning them, but everyone knew who had them. They were played in corners, beneath cloaks, behind closed doors. And when the cards came out, even the dice stopped rolling. Something about them demanded attention. They brought out something colder than greed: calculation. In dice, you trusted luck. In cards, you watched men. You studied posture, breath, sweat. It was a different kind of danger. Slower, sharper, with fewer second chances. The decks were cursed, yes. But the curse wasn't in the ink. It was in the silence between moves. The flicker of doubt. The moment someone realized they were losing and had no one left to blame. Cards were rare, yes. But in places like this, that only made them more powerful, more dangerous, and far more likely to end in blood. The wine here isn't poured for pleasure. It isn't savored, swirled, or sniffed. No one speaks of vintage. No one asks where the grapes were grown. The liquid that fills the cups is thick, sour, and lukewarm, closer to vinegar than to anything celebratory. But it flows constantly. Cups are refilled before they're empty. Jugs appear without being ordered. It's not hospitality. It's function. The wine is a tool, like the dice, like the knife, like the darkness. It oils the room, slows the hands, blurs the lines between mistake and intention. The first cup calms the nerves. The second silences the doubts. The third makes anything seem possible. And after that, it's no longer a choice. It's gravity. The wine doesn't ask. It takes. In a room where fortunes vanish in seconds, alcohol becomes the soft rope that pulls players deeper. It distracts from the weight of each bet, numbs the sting of every loss, makes laughter easier and consequences more distant. A man might hesitate to wager his last coin until another cup warms his throat. He might notice the dealer's hand moving strangely, but the wine says it's not worth fighting over. It dulls suspicion just enough to keep the game moving. No one drinks alone here. Even those who don't play are given cups, gently, insistently. Because a drunk crowd is a quiet one. It stumbles instead of shouts. It forgets instead of resents. And most importantly, it believes that luck is changing, that the next hand will win, that this place isn't as cruel as it seems. Not all drink freely. Some sip with calculation, feigning fogginess to lull the others. Some pour theirs into the straw beneath the table. But even the cautious can't avoid its influence. The smell alone clings to the air, to the skin, seeping into clothes, into breath, into thought. It becomes the rhythm of the room, the slap of dice, the scrape of coins, the swallow of wine. And when tempers rise, as they always do, the alcohol fans the flame. Fights here don't erupt from clarity. They bloom in haze. A misheard word, a misunderstood look, a stumble mistaken for insult. The wine softens the world just enough to let violence slip through unnoticed. By the time the cup hits the floor, the blade is already halfway out of the sheath. No one remembers how much they drank. That's part of the design. The night blurs, not because it was unremarkable, but because the wine dissolved its edges. You wake with the taste still on your tongue, dry and sharp and sour. You try to recall the moment you lost, the moment you shouted, the moment you agreed to something you shouldn't have, and it's gone, drowned in a red fog. And yet, when you return, because most do, the cup is waiting again. The same jug, the same taste, the same slow descent. Not a celebration, not even an escape. Just a steady hand guiding you back to the table, back to the edge, back to the same mistake. Softened just enough to make you forget how many times you've made it before. The smell hits before the room does. It clings to the doorway, spills into the alley, settles in the folds of clothing and the backs of throats. It's not one odor, not something simple or nameable. It's a blend, thick and slow, the kind of scent that lives in walls and never leaves. First comes the sweat, not fresh, not sharp, but aged and layered. The sweat of unwashed bodies pressed too close for too long. It rises from skin, from wool, from the grime under fingernails. It's the smell of nerves, of hours spent hunched over tables, of tension that never fully releases. Then comes the beer, sour, flat, spilled and reabsorbed 100 times. It lives in the floorboards, in the stains on the benches, in the wood of the mugs. It doesn't smell like drink. It smells like decay pretending to be pleasure. Smoke folds over it all like a blanket. Not the clean scent of firewood, but something rougher. Damp straw, scorched grease, bits of old rope thrown into the flames. The torches burn low and guttering, coughing out more stink than light. Some of the haze is from pipes, cheap and oily, filled with whatever plant matter was available. It settles into the air until breathing becomes a choice between suffocation and acceptance. Eyes water, nostrils sting. But no one complains. Complaining would mean noticing. And to notice the smell would be to recognize where you are and what you've accepted just by stepping inside. So instead, people drink deeper, breathe through their mouths, and pretend it's all part of the charm. It becomes a kind of baptism. If you can stomach the scent, you belong here. If not, you were never meant to stay. But beneath the surface odors, the sweat, the beer, the smoke, lies something quieter, heavier. The slow rot of hope left too long in one place. It's not physical, not entirely, but it has weight. It comes from the corners, from the backs of the eyes, from the soaked-through coin purses and the promises whispered through clenched teeth. It's the scent of broken plans, of silent collapses. The man who walks in thinking he'll win back what he lost last week adds to it. So does the one who just put his last boot up as collateral. They carry the stink of defeat before the dice even roll. It's not sweat or breath. It's the scent of spirit breaking, of dignity loosening, of something unspoken unraveling just beneath the skin. It doesn't hit you like a punch. It seeps in slowly until you can't tell whether it's in the air or in you, and it lingers. Long after the crowd has gone, after the torches gutter out, after the night has swallowed the last shout, the smell remains. In the silence, it becomes louder. It clings to the table legs, to the discarded mugs, to the rag used to wipe up the mess. It doesn't fade with time. It deepens. By morning, the room is empty, but it still smells lived in, fought in, lost in. And when the next group comes through the door, new faces, old debts, fresh coins, they breathe it in without noticing. It welcomes them like a curtain drawn closed, like a whisper that says, This is where things go to be forgotten. This is where hope is buried, one sour breath at a time. The medieval casino didn't need to mark its territory. Its scent did that for it. A permanent presence, heavier than any chain, darker than any shadow. Noise was never background here. It wasn't ambient or accidental. It was a signal, a tide, a pulse that told the room where the tension sat. The louder it got, the higher the stakes climbed, not in coins alone, but in risk, in desperation, in things whispered and regretted. The hum would start low, murmurs, a few chuckles, the scrape of chairs. Then came the calls, the laughter too sharp, the curses too rehearsed. By the time voices were rising, by the time two men were speaking at once across the table, everyone knew someone had just bet more than they should have. The crowd didn't react to what was said, but to the weight beneath it. They leaned in when the words turned quick. They fell silent when a hand hit the table too hard. And always, beneath the voices, the rhythm of loss deepened. The volume had its own logic. No one cheered for small bets. Copper didn't inspire shouting, but silver did. A ring did. A deed to a cart. A name scrawled on parchment. A promise made under breath. Those drew sound like blood draws flies. The louder it became, the more the room tilted toward collapse. A player shouting with confidence was rarely in control. A laugh too long meant a bluff. And the crowd, half drunk and half cruel, fed on the spectacle. They encouraged the rise, not to witness victory, but to taste the fall. When a man slammed his coin down and barked out a challenge, they roared not because they believed in him, but because they wanted to see what would happen when he lost. And when the moment passed, the cheers didn't linger. They scattered, already searching for the next spark. Sometimes the noise came all at once, an explosion, a surge, a clap that cut through the haze like a blade. A cup overturned, a chair kicked back, a voice cracking into a shout that wasn't about the game anymore. And when that happened, when the volume climbed too fast and too hard, everyone went still for half a second. Not out of fear, but out of readiness. Because loudness didn't just mean betting, it meant danger. Words were safer than silence, but only just. And when someone pushed too far, when the stakes outgrew the table, the noise shifted. It thickened, turned jagged. And then something broke. A bottle, a nose, the illusion of control. By the time quiet returned, something had changed. Someone was gone. Something was lost. And the room, greedy and restless, was already climbing again. It was never steady. The sound ebbed and flowed with each round, each lie, each flicker of hope. It built like pressure behind the eyes, behind the teeth. Even those who didn't play felt it. They tensed when the laughter rose. They flinched when the table rocked. Because they knew, the loudest moment in the room was never the peak. It was the ledge before the fall. The second before the coin dropped, the word slipped, the blade was drawn. The medieval casino had no bell, no trumpet, no curtain. Its drama was measured in decibels. And when it reached a certain pitch, everyone understood. Something important. Maybe a man, maybe a rule, maybe the night itself was about to be lost. They didn't hide. That was the first rule. A cheat in the medieval casino didn't slink in shadows or wear masks. He sat at the table like everyone else, drank from the same mugs, laughed at the same jokes. He knew the names, the games, the rhythms of the room, and most importantly, He knew exactly how far he could go. His role wasn't secret. It was understood. Not announced, never official, but known. He was part of the machinery, part of the performance, like the tilted table or the sour wine. And as long as he didn't get greedy, as long as he didn't embarrass anyone with power, he was allowed to stay. Allowed to win. Allowed to play with loaded dice and marked cards and gestures rehearsed until they looked like reflexes. His presence made the others try harder, made them angry, made them spend more. That was the point. The owner always knew. Of course he did. Sometimes the cheat worked for him directly. A cut of the winnings, a share of the drinks, protection when things turned ugly. Other times the arrangement was less formal, but no less firm. The cheat brought action. He stirred the pot. He gave the regulars someone to beat, someone to accuse, someone to chase. And if he got caught, if a hand was grabbed mid-palm switch, or a coin turned out to be hollow, well, that too was part of the game. Sometimes there'd be a scuffle, sometimes a beating, but rarely did it go too far. Because everyone knew today it was him, tomorrow it might be you. And besides, a good cheat didn't get caught. A good cheat made you think he was cheating when he wasn't, and not notice when he was. That was the dance. And the house always led. There were different kinds. The flash cheat, with fast hands and faster talk, who relied on distraction and swagger. The quiet one, who watched more than he spoke, and moved only when the others were too tired to notice. The team, 2 or 3 who pretended to be strangers but split the winnings later. Their glances practiced, their arguments staged. And then there were the ones who cheated without tools. No tricks, no devices, just instinct and an understanding of people so sharp it might as well have been sorcery. They could smell fear, feel tension, know exactly when a player was bluffing or about to break. They didn't win every hand. That would have been suspicious. They won just enough and lost just enough to stay invisible. These were the most dangerous kind. Because even when they left the table, they kept playing. Everyone claimed to hate them. Everyone said the same thing. Cheats ruined the game, made it unfair, made it unsafe. But deep down, the room needed them. They added danger. They made every win feel earned or stolen back. They gave the night a shape, a villain, a story. And more often than not, the ones who shouted loudest about justice were the same ones who slipped an extra die into their boot. Hypocrisy wasn't a problem here. It was expected. The medieval casino didn't run on fairness. It ran on motion. Of coins, of wine, of blood. And the cheats kept that motion alive. They were the flaw in the system that made the system feel real. The worm in the apple. The trick in the light. And everyone, from the poorest gambler to the richest owner, knew the truth. Without them, the whole thing would have fallen quiet. And quiet, in a place like this, was the one thing no one could afford. A shout in this place never meant just one thing. It could come from a sudden win, a throw of the dice that landed just right, a card pulled from the filth that sealed a hand, a wager that paid off against every odd. The voice would rise, sharp and loud, cutting through the smoky air with something that almost sounded like joy. But joy here was never clean. Behind it lay tension, disbelief, hunger. The man shouting didn't cheer because he was happy. He shouted because he was surprised, because for once the world hadn't collapsed. The cheer carried desperation, as if speaking louder could make the moment last. And around him others turned to look, some smiling, some sneering, some reaching for their own coins, thinking maybe luck had shifted in the room. But everyone knew better. The louder the shout, the shorter the victory. In a place like this, every cheer was a warning, because often the next shout came from a different mouth, one that hadn't won, one that had just lost more than he could admit, or suspected he'd been tricked, or couldn't tell the difference anymore. The shift was fast, laughter curling into accusation, pride warping into insult. Words flew first: liar, cheat, bastard. Then hands, sometimes just slammed against the table, sometimes into someone's face. And the volume swelled with it. A single voice turned into two, then five, then the whole room, rising like a wave about to crash. The line between celebration and violence disappeared. A man still smiling could be the one throwing the first punch. A winner could be dragged to the floor before the next roll. The sound didn't warn of danger. It was the danger. And no one tried to stop it. Not yet. Not until something broke. It wasn't always a fight. Sometimes it was theater. Men raising their voices not out of rage, but to show they were still in control of the game, of themselves, of the narrative. A shout could reclaim attention. It could distract from a bad hand, intimidate a quieter player, shift the air in your favor. Noise was a tool. The loudest man at the table often lost, but no one would say that to his face. So they let him roar, let him slap the table, slam his mug, stand up, and raise his arms like a priest calling for thunder. The others watched. Some joined in. Some mimicked. It created rhythm, motion, spectacle, and that was good for business. A loud room drew more players, more coin, more reasons to pretend the game wasn't rigged. Even if the yelling meant nothing, it sounded like life. And in a place so close to ruin, that illusion was priceless. But real noise, real ragged, throat-torn screaming, always came at the end. Not the end of the night or the game, but the end of patience, of pride, of pretense. The kind of scream that came from the gut, from behind clenched teeth, from the part of a man that knew he'd just crossed a line he couldn't return from. Maybe he'd lost too much. Maybe he'd been caught cheating. Maybe someone touched the wrong hand at the wrong time. But once that scream tore through the room, everything changed. The torches flickered. The crowd stepped back. And somewhere in the dark, someone stood up slowly. That was when the table flipped. That was when the blade came out. And that was when the shouting stopped, replaced by something quieter, heavier. Breathing, grunts, the scrape of boots, because in the medieval casino, screaming was just another kind of signal. And silence, when it finally came, was the only thing more dangerous. Debts here weren't written with ink. Ink could be smudged, erased, denied. Paper could burn, tear, vanish in a puddle of beer or the corner of a flame. But wood remembered. Wood carried weight. A notch carved into the side of the table was harder to ignore. A set of marks scratched deep into a beam near the ceiling meant someone owed something. A coin, a favor, a piece of themselves. Some marks were coded, a private system between owner and dealer. Others were obvious, a name, half-spelled, a tally, a crude symbol of what had been lost. Even the knife used to cut the debt was part of the ritual. Dull, stained, handled too many times. When it pressed into wood, It made a sound that turned heads. That was the point. A debt wasn't real until it echoed, until it left a scar. The walls were thick with them, layer after layer of scratches, gouges, names carved and crossed out, lines overlapping until the surface resembled bark after a storm. Some of the marks were old, so old no one remembered what they meant. Others were still fresh, the wood pale and splintered where it had been newly cut. Some debts were settled, some weren't. But no one erased them. That wasn't how it worked. A debt paid didn't mean the mark disappeared. It stayed as a reminder of risk, of survival, of how close someone came to ruin. And for many, the wall became a kind of silent ledger. They'd run their fingers over it on the way in, searching for the line that still bore their name. Some did it in shame, others with pride. Because in this place, owing meant belonging. A man without a mark was either new or lying. But not all debts were kept on walls. Some were scratched into the underside of benches, or the legs of tables, or the door frame that led into the back room. Some were carved in hidden spots, meant to be found only by certain eyes, and others were more personal. A knife dragged across skin, shallow and slow, left a mark that couldn't be lost in shadows. On forearms, on palms, behind the knee, places covered in clothes but close enough to memory. A man might offer his arm instead of coin, and the knife would come out just the same. One line meant a coin, 2 meant a promise, 3, something worse. These marks weren't common, but they existed, and everyone knew what they meant. A man with too many scars didn't have to speak. The room already knew what he'd given, and what he still hadn't paid. Debt here wasn't abstract. It wasn't numbers on a page or words in a book. It was a living thing, physical, visible, breathing down necks and crawling through splinters. It followed people home. It woke them at night. It changed how others looked at them. The man who owed too much sat differently, moved differently, laughed with a tightness around the eyes. He avoided certain glances. He knew which marks were his, and so did everyone else. The carved wood became a silent chorus, reminding him every time he reached for a drink or a die. And still, new debts were cut every night. New names, new tallies, new promises made beneath flickering torchlight. The wood groaned under the weight of it all, but it never broke. It held every secret, every failure, every lie passed off as luck. Because in the medieval casino, nothing was more permanent than a broken promise carved into something older than shame. They moved through the room like smoke, noticed only when they needed to be. Not players, not voices, not names etched into tables or debts carved in wood. Women in the medieval casino weren't there to gamble. They were there to make others gamble worse. Their presence was part of the rhythm, a hand on a shoulder, a laugh a second too long, a glance that landed right before the dice were thrown. Some served drinks, others collected coin. A few simply leaned in close, asking questions in voices soft enough to slip through thought. They didn't belong to the game, not officially. But the game didn't work without them. They made men feel watched, admired, important. And when that illusion was strong enough, it made them careless. Fingers loosened on coin purses. Eyes wandered from the table. Luck began to leak away, not by curse, but by attention given to the wrong thing at the right time. They were not wives, not companions, not lovers. though they sometimes pretended to be all three. Some worked for the house, some for themselves, some for someone else entirely. What they took wasn't always money. Sometimes it was secrets. What a man said after his third drink, who he swore to ruin, what debts he lied about. A woman sitting nearby could learn more in an hour than a thief could learn in a week, and the house paid well for that. Information was its own currency. A whispered name could be worth more than a handful of silver. And when coin wasn't enough to play, some men offered what wasn't theirs to give. A daughter waiting at home, a sister needing food, a woman already standing in the corner, eyes down, waiting for the outcome of a game she never chose to be part of. The room accepted all bets, no matter what form they took. Some played their own games, quiet ones. A ring lifted from a distracted hand. A purse cut as a man leaned in too far. A conversation overheard and passed on before the hour changed. And when they were caught, when fingers closed too hard around a wrist, or a voice rose too loud in accusation, the room didn't stop. There was no rescue, only a pause, a shift, and then motion again. Some were beaten, some vanished. Some came back the next night as if nothing had happened, with a new bruise and the same smile. Others didn't come back at all, and no one asked why. In this place, women were both invisible and dangerous. They were part of the structure, like the warped floor or the crooked beams. To ignore them was to misunderstand the game. To notice them too late was to lose it entirely. They were not respected, but they were feared in a quiet, unspoken way, because they saw what others missed. They remembered things no one thought worth remembering, and they understood that the table was never fair, not for anyone. Some found power in that. Most simply survived it. And still, every night, new faces appeared, painted mouths, sharp eyes, hands that moved with practiced ease. Some lasted longer than others. Some played so well, they never had to touch the dice. But all of them knew the truth. In the medieval casino, a woman's value was always measured by someone else's loss. She was a tool, a trick, a turn of the wrist that led to ruin. And whether she stayed by choice or by debt no longer mattered. Because once she stepped through the door, the house considered her part of the game. Just another piece to be played, or played against, or played away. They were always there, not just present, but embedded, like stains on the table, like grooves worn into the bench. The regulars, men with no fixed trade, no steady income, no name that meant anything beyond these walls. They didn't farm, didn't smith, didn't preach. They existed in the margins, drifting between markets and stables and back alleys, yet somehow never missed a night. No one could say exactly where they got their coin. They appeared with just enough to play, never more, rarely less. A few bits of silver, a chipped token, something shiny enough to pass across the table. It wasn't about wealth. It was about presence. The regulars gave the room weight. Their voices filled the silence. Their laughter, dry and brittle, came at the right moments. They played not to win, but to stay in motion, to keep the wheel turning. Without them, the place felt hollow. They knew every trick, every rule that changed when the owner wasn't looking. They could name 3 ways to load a die, and 5 to spot it. They recognized a bluff by the way a man scratched his chin or blinked too fast. They didn't play like the hopeful. They played like mechanics. Every move calculated, every loss accepted like tax. But even the best of them lost more than they won. That was understood. Regulars didn't survive by staying lucky. They survived by staying necessary. They gave the room its memory, its habits, its shape. When a new player came in, it was the regulars who watched him first, measured him, decided how rough the night might get. Sometimes they offered advice. More often, they offered silence. Their role wasn't to welcome, it was to anchor, to keep the place from drifting too far into chaos or mercy. No one saw them work. No one saw them leave. It was as if they lived here, though the room had no beds. Some claimed they ran errands for the owner, that they delivered messages best not spoken aloud, that they collected debts when softer hands failed. Others whispered darker things, that they sold information or bodies or protection, that their coin came not from labor, but from favors granted in quiet corners. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that they always had enough to sit down. Even if it was the last copper, even if it wasn't theirs. They wagered with a kind of defiance, as if daring the game to take what little remained. And when they lost, they shrugged, leaned back, and waited. Because sooner or later, another coin would appear. Another chance to play. Another night that needed filling. They aged in the chair. Faces changed around them. Voices rose and disappeared, but the regulars remained. Hair went gray. Eyes grew dull. Hands trembled, but the grip on the dice stayed firm. Some had been coming for decades, long enough to remember when the walls were clean, when the ceiling didn't leak. They didn't talk about the past, but you could see it in the way they watched the room. Not with hope, not even with interest, but with familiarity. This was their church, their home, their grave. They weren't rich, they weren't respected, but they were necessary. Because in a place built on risk, someone had to embody the certainty of return. Someone had to prove that losing over and over could still the kind of survival. And so they stayed, jobless, restless, always waiting, always with just enough coin to play one more hand. They entered late, usually when the candles burned low and the wine had soured in the jug, alone or in pairs cloaked against the night, moving like men with secrets instead of sermons. At first glance, they looked like any other visitor, hunched, weary, drawn to places where coin moved quickly and questions moved slowly. But the fabric gave them away. Not rich robes, not embroidered vestments, but plain wool worn thin from weather and repetition. A dark collar, a small wooden cross. Symbols tucked close to the chest, half hidden but never fully denied. These were not impostors. They were real priests, men who, by morning, would stand before altars, hands raised in blessing, mouths full of warnings about sin. And yet here they were, at the edge of the table, eyeing the dice with the same hunger as any drunk or debt-torn thief. They didn't speak much, not in the way others did. No boasts, no curses loud enough to draw attention. But their silence wasn't shame. It was focus. They played carefully, methodically, eyes scanning not just the table but the faces around it. Some said they came to study temptation, to see it up close, to understand the devil's work before preaching against it. Others said they came because they were human, and the weight of their own sermons had grown too heavy. Whatever the reason, they always brought coin. Never much, never flashy, but real. A silver piece hidden in the hem. a copper wrapped in parchment, a favor promised in the confessional and paid, quietly, in drink. And when they wagered, they did it with the same gravity as a blessing. Not fast, not loud, but with a kind of desperate precision, as if each throw might answer something no prayer could. The room didn't judge, not out loud. In a place built on denial, where lies changed hands faster than money, no one had the right to call another man a hypocrite. Still, the presence of a priest shifted the air. Some players crossed themselves. Others moved farther down the bench. A few muttered under their breath, asking whether God watched a man's hand when he rolled bone. But most ignored them. Let them drink. Let them lose. Let them pretend, just for a night, that divine order had no hold here. And when they won, which was rare, they left quickly, as if ashamed of grace, as if afraid someone might ask why salvation came in the form of 2 lucky 6s. And when they lost, which was often, they stayed longer, drinking more, speaking less, until the robe hung looser, the cross tilted sideways, and the man beneath looked like anyone else. By dawn, they were gone, slipped out before the coals cooled, back to the chapel, the pulpit, the litany of absolution. No one mentioned them after. The marks they left on the bench were no deeper than anyone else's. Their debts, if they made them, vanished into the same silence that swallowed all promises here. And yet, their presence lingered, not as scandal, but as confirmation. That even the pious came to lose. That even those who preached against sin sometimes sought its company. Not loudly, not often, but enough to remind the room that no one was immune. That inside these walls, belief didn't matter. Only risk, only luck, and the quiet truth that sometimes even a priest needed to sit in darkness, place a coin on the table, and wait for something greater to answer. Or not. They arrived in better boots. That was often the first clue. Clean leather, polished buckles, a cloak lined with fur even in mild weather. Landowners didn't dress like beggars. They walked straighter, nodded less, looked longer at the other players before sitting down. And when they placed their first coin on the table, it was always with a certain ease, not the cautious tremble of a man counting what he could afford to lose, but the confident flick of someone who believed loss didn't apply to him. They came from estates just outside the town, from manor houses set behind low stone walls, where others tilled the fields and counted the eggs. But here, inside the thick smoke and the crooked walls of the casino, their titles meant nothing. What mattered was the wager, and few wagered more recklessly than men who had never bent their backs for their own bread. They didn't gamble out of need. That was part of the danger. A poor man bet for survival. A landowner bet out of boredom. And when a man risks something he doesn't respect, he risks it too easily. A few coins became a week's rent. A week's rent became half a harvest. Half a harvest became the field itself, or the cow, or the cart, or the men hired to dig the ditch. At first, it was all verbal. A promise, a nod, a trusted witness. But once written, it turned binding. The parchment bore a seal. The house kept a copy. And just like that, acres of land passed through hands slick with sweat and wine. Some tried to win it back the same night. Most didn't. They left with less than they brought. Not in their purse, but in the world waiting for them outside. A family's food, a tenant's winter, all gone in a single roll. Sometimes the stakes grew stranger. A horse, a sword, a hound. A shipment of grain not yet harvested, a favor owed by a distant cousin, and at times, even people. Daughters, most often. Promised in marriage to settle a score, or placed as collateral until a debt could be cleared. No ceremony, no witness but the dealer. Just a quiet agreement, sealed with wine and the scrape of metal on wood. It wasn't common, but it happened. And when it did, no one intervened. The room didn't care who was offered, only that the wager was met. Some lords returned the next day with another daughter. Some never returned at all. Their lands changed hands. Their names grew quiet. The manor gates closed early, and the villagers whispered about what had been lost. But in the casino there was no mourning. Just another game, another coin, another man too proud to walk away. And yet they kept coming. Not all, but enough. Drawn by the thrill of risk, by the illusion of control, by the hunger to feel something sharper than tax ledgers and dull dinners. In their homes, they gave orders. Here they took chances, and the room welcomed them. It didn't matter how high they stood elsewhere. Once seated, they were just another voice, another hand tossing dice, another future riding on wood and chance. Some learned restraint, too late, but learned it all the same. Others spiraled, losing more with each visit, until their names no longer opened doors. And when they fell quietly, no fanfare, no justice, just a chair left empty and a new player in better boots taking their place. Because in the medieval casino, nobility meant nothing, but recklessness, that always found a seat. They came in through the back, too small for the front door, too quiet for the table. Boys, mostly. 12, 13, maybe younger. No names worth remembering. Just eyes too wide, hands too quick, and a hunger that had nothing to do with food. They swept the floors, cleared the mugs, emptied the piss buckets when the smell got too thick to ignore. They were paid in scraps, if paid at all. Stale crusts, the heel of a cheese, a sip of something sour when no one was looking. But they didn't come for the food. Not really. They came for the noise, the heat, the closeness of things that mattered. They came to watch grown men risk everything on bone and breath, and they stayed because the longer they watched, the more it looked like a patha. A crooked, broken path, but still a way forward. At first, they were invisible, shadows moving between chairs, silent enough to make the rats nervous. No one spoke to them unless shouting. No one taught them unless hitting. But they learned anyway. They watched how dice were held, how cards were read, how the seasoned players waited 2 beats before betting. They watched how drinks were poured when someone needed to forget, and how silence could win a hand faster than a boast. And they watched what happened when someone lost, how the room shifted, how the laughter stopped, how debt moved from table to doorway in the blink of an eye. These boys saw everything because no one believed they mattered. And that, more than anything, was what made them dangerous. Because eventually, they weren't just watching. It started small. A fingertip brushing against a fallen coin. A mug left half full, finished in the corner. A word overheard and repeated for coin or favor. Then came the dice, not thrown, just held, felt, studied, mimicked. When no one was around, they practiced behind the tavern, whispering bets into the dark. Some began playing among themselves, with pebbles or marked bits of wood, copying the gestures they saw every night. And some, inevitably, tried to join the real game. At first, they were laughed at, then ignored, then tolerated. A few caught on quick, too quick, and were pulled aside. Not to be punished, but to be taught. By the cheats, by the dealers, by the men who knew a sharp eye when they saw one. They didn't offer lessons out of kindness. They offered them to make something useful. A boy who could palm a die was worth more than one who carried a mop. And so they stayed. Some disappeared into the room like smoke, no longer boys, but not yet men, living in the cracks between games and fights and debts. Others fell fast, caught cheating before they were ready, caught stealing what wasn't coin. A few were beaten, a few vanished. No one asked where they went. The room didn't mourn children. It consumed them. And those who remained learned that, too. That survival meant movement. That the only way to avoid being stepped on was to stay useful. So they carried trays, whispered warnings, rigged the benches to favor the regulars. And sometimes, when the night grew quiet and the players grew tired, one of them would sit, just for a round, just to feel what it meant to risk something. And if they won, they smiled. And if they lost, they didn't flinch. Because in the medieval casino, even the smallest servant knew the rules. Watch, wait, disappear, and then return with quieter hands and sharper eyes. They entered without flourish, coats buttoned high, expressions flat, boots cleaner than the floor deserved. No one greeted them loudly. No one laughed in their direction. But chairs opened, mugs were filled, and the game adjusted without instruction. These men were known, not by name, but by silence. They held court during the day in rooms with windows and crests and rules etched in Latin. They wore black, or something close to it, and spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word required approval. In daylight, they condemned gambling as vice, fined it, taxed it. In some towns, they banned it outright. And then, when the sun dipped low and the torches guttered, they came here, not to spectate, but to play. The same hands that signed decrees now shook dice into a palm. The same mouths that spoke of law now whispered bets into the dark. They didn't hide. That was part of the game. No mask, no change of voice, just a different posture, a different lighting. As if darkness made hypocrisy less sharp. The players never questioned it. They had no right to. In places like this, power didn't wear uniforms. It wore comfort. These men didn't shout, didn't pound the table. They placed their bets with quiet confidence, and the dice often rolled in their favor. No one accused them of cheating, not out loud. But when they lost, it felt theatrical. When they won, it felt rehearsed. The dealer never met their eyes. The cheats stayed away from their tables. And the regulars kept their hands close to their laps, because the judges didn't need to cheat. The game bent toward them, the way rooms bend toward fire, not by choice but by understanding. Sometimes, during the day, one of the players would stand before them in a court of law, charged with theft, with fraud, with unlawful betting. And the judge would listen, expression blank, fingers tapping slowly on the same wood where dice had bounced the night before. No mention of the game, no nod of recognition. Just the ritual of justice played out in daylight, sterilized by protocol. A fine, a warning, a brief jailing, and then, lo, Later, a seat returned to them at the table. No one spoke of the contradiction. That would be bad form. In this place, morality was a matter of hours. Vice was darkness. Law was morning. And in between there was only quiet agreement that some rules were for daylight and others for the kind of night that never ended. They weren't the only ones. Other officials came too, scribes, taxmen, aldermen. But the judges had a presence that settled over the room like dust. They reminded everyone of where the line was and how easily it could be moved. They played with more than coin. They played with control. Every nod, every pause, every quiet comment had weight. And the room absorbed it all, understanding instinctively that power didn't need to shout to be obeyed. It just needed to sit at the table, roll the dice, and watch. And if one night they lost big, if they slammed a hand down or muttered a threat too loud, the room pretended not to hear. Because in the medieval casino, everyone gambled, but only a few got to decide what counted as a crime. They were always there, not in the center of the room, not at the loudest tables, but in the edges, just beyond the torchlight, just close enough to reach. They didn't wear masks. They didn't need to. In a place where everyone lied and everything moved, a pickpocket didn't stand out. The game itself was distraction enough. A crowd leaning in on a high-stakes roll gave plenty of cover. A winning shout masked the sound of a purse string snapping. A drunken laugh hid the shift of weight when a satchel was pulled away. The thieves didn't rush. They glided. They watched longer than they acted. And when they struck, it was rarely noticed until much later. When the drink was gone, the game was lost, and the last coin had vanished from a pocket that had once felt full. The room had no sympathy, only shrugs. If it wasn't your first time, you should have known better. But not all thieves came in planning to steal. Some entered as players. Some even came with pride, ready to test luck or skill or both. But the game has a way of reshaping people, slowly at first, then all at once. A man who lost too much, too fast, began to glance at coin the way a starving man glances at bread. He didn't start with theft. He started with wishing, then watching, then wondering whether the man next to him might not notice if one coin slid an inch the wrong way. And once that thought planted itself, it bloomed quickly. The difference between gambler and thief wasn't the weight of their purse. It was how long they could wait before reaching. Some couldn't. And the room never stopped them. It only watched to see whether they'd succeed or fail loud enough to become the night's lesson. When caught, the punishment was not decided by law, but by mood. Sometimes a thief was dragged outside and left bloodied in the alley. Sometimes he was stripped of everything, including his dignity, and shoved back in to walk the floor like a ghost. But sometimes he was given a seat, offered wine, spoken to, because the house knew value when it saw it. A clever thief could become a useful tool, someone who could be pointed in the right direction, someone who could take a fall when needed, someone who could be blamed. And if not? If he had no charm, no skill, no potential, then he simply disappeared into the wall, the gutter, the grave, and no one remembered his name. In a place where everyone risked something, the thief simply risked honesty. And when he lost, no one called it unfair. The irony was that many left the room poorer than the thieves. The man who wagered his boots, his belt, his name, he often paid more than the one who slid a coin out of someone else's coat. The room didn't judge the method, only the outcome. and the line between victim and criminal blurred until it vanished. A player who lost too much could become a thief. A thief who stole enough could become a player. Some switched roles within the same night. And when the torches burned low and the benches emptied, it was often hard to tell who had walked in with good intentions and who had simply come to take. In the medieval casino, everyone watched their coin, everyone watched their back, but no one watched themselves. Not until the moment came when their hand moved without thinking, and suddenly they too were something they had once feared, or worse, something they had once pitied. No titles were spoken here. No one was called lord or serf. No one bowed or scraped or held the door. At the table, everyone was equal and equally vulnerable. A man might have spent the morning shoveling dung and the evening cutting off a thief's hand. But once the dice hit the wood, they were just players. The pockmarked executioner with the stiff shoulders and the stained cuffs could sit across from a field hand still caked in soil, and neither would flinch. No one asked questions. The game didn't care what kind of life you led outside its glow. It only cared what you risked and how you played. The blade didn't follow the hand here. The plow didn't weigh more than the purse. All that mattered was the roll, the bet, the silence between them. But tension ran under the surface. Everyone knew who sat where. Even if no one spoke it aloud, they could tell. The executioner's hands were too steady, his gaze too flat. He didn't react to outbursts, didn't blink when a man cursed the gods. He watched the game like someone who had seen too many endings. The peasant, on the other hand, had rough fingers, nervous eyes, a voice that cracked when pressed. And yet, the dice didn't favor one more than the other. The game, for all its cruelty, made no distinction. If anything, it leaned into the irony. The man who ended lives in daylight could lose everything to the man who fed pigs. And sometimes he did. And when it happened, no one laughed. Because luck in this place was sacred. Mocking it was like whistling in a graveyard. You could, but everyone would step away from you. What made it stranger was how often they returned. The same faces, the same players. Different nights, different stakes, same silence. The executioner might win back what he lost, or double it, or leave empty again. The peasant might leave with more than he came with, or nothing but bruises and regret. But both returned, as if the table offered something outside of coin, a kind of flattening, a place where the burdens of their roles, the expectations, the weight of what they had to be, were stripped down to the simple act of gambling. Here, no one asked the peasant for taxes, no one begged the executioner for mercy. They sat, they bet, they lost. And in that strange, twisted equality, something close to peace emerged. Bitter, fleeting, but real. Of course, others watched, not with open judgment, but with that quiet interest that fills a room when the stakes aren't just silver. They watched the executioner's hands, wondering how many they'd seen bound. They watched the peasant's eyes, wondering how many mouths he'd failed to feed. And they watched the game itself, curious whether justice or irony would win. Sometimes, when the table grew loud and the stakes rose too high, someone would say something careless. A comment, a question, a joke that landed too close to truth, and the silence that followed would be thick enough to drink. Because in the medieval casino, everyone had a story. But no one came to tell it. They came to forget it. Or, failing that, to risk it. And at the table, even the sharpest blade and the hardest life were reduced to numbers carved on bone, thrown by hand, settled by chance, watched by everyone. Winning here wasn't like winning anywhere else. There were no cheers that lasted longer than a breath, no celebrations worth remembering. A man who began to win, truly win, was first met with nods, then glances, then silence. At first, his growing pile of coins drew curiosity, then suspicion. There was no applause, only tightening shoulders and shifting seats. The house noticed. So did the players. And somewhere in the back of the room, someone stopped drinking. There was a threshold in the medieval casino, though no one could see exactly where it lay. Win a few hands, and you were lucky. Win too many, and you became something else. A threat, a problem, a lesson waiting to be taught. Because the room didn't reward success. It studied it. It measured how loud you became, how long you smiled, how wide you reached. And then, it reached back. Most winners didn't make it past the third night. That was the pattern. They came in, unknown but sharp-eyed. They played low stakes first, quiet, cautious, slow. Then came a turn, a night where the dice landed just right. The cards opened wide, the coin grew heavy in their hand. The room watched, the house listened, and the winner, flush with luck and false confidence, began to think the place could be beaten. They drank too freely. They boasted too early. They came back too quickly. And on the second night, the hands got faster, the bets got bolder, and the other players leaned away just slightly, giving space the way one does when fire jumps the hearth. By the third night, something snapped. Maybe it was the odds. Maybe it was someone else's patience. Or maybe it was the room itself, tipping back toward balance in the only way it knew how, by making sure the winner left with less than he came in with, sometimes much less. Not all downfalls were loud. Some winners simply disappeared. One day flush, the next day gone. No blood, no shouting, just a chair left empty and a story no one finished telling. Others were more dramatic, accused of cheating, cornered, tested. A sudden shove, a scream, a blow that landed too clean to be improvised, and beneath it all, the unspoken understanding that this place wasn't built for victory, not in the long term. It tolerated small wins, allowed tiny resurrections, forgave a bit of luck, but it never welcomed dominance. Because winning too much here didn't inspire awe. It broke the rhythm. It made others uncomfortable. It made the house uncomfortable. And comfort, in a room like this, was the closest thing to law. The smartest players lost on purpose. Not everything, not all the time, just enough. Enough to stay invisible. Enough to be part of the room instead of standing out from it. They let go of hands they could win. They folded on purpose. They kept their voice low, their purse thinner than it needed to be. They knew the truth, that in the medieval casino, survival didn't belong to the lucky. It belonged to the unnoticed. Because the house didn't care who walked in. It only cared who stayed. And if you won too much, for too long, you didn't stay. Whether by blade, by shame, or by quiet disappearance, you left. That was the price of victory here. Not glory, not respect, just a faster path to the door, or the floor, or the dark beyond the threshold, where no one asked questions and no one wanted the answers. Loss wasn't measured in coins alone. In fact, by the time a man reached for his last piece of silver, the real losing had often already begun. Coin was only the beginning, something to wager, something to give away before the rest started to unravel. In a room like this, a man could lose his boots, his belt, his ring. Then he could lose the mule he'd left tied outside. Then the tools he used to earn his bread. Then the promise of a thing he didn't even own yet. It happened quickly, sometimes in a single night. And once the coin was gone, the game didn't stop. The house didn't send you home. Instead, it asked a quieter question. What else do you have to offer? And that question had many answers. Some men gave favors. Others gave time. And some gave parts of themselves they never thought could be turned into currency. Fingers were the most common. Not entire hands, those were harder to explain in the daylight. But joints, mostly. The tip of a finger, lost to a blade after a final warning, went unheeded. Sometimes the debt was paid in public, in full view of the table. A hand pinned, a knife produced, and then a scream swallowed quickly by the noise of resumed play. It was brutal, but it worked. A man who lost a finger rarely asked for more credit, and the room respected the blood more than any apology. Others lost less visible things, a tooth here, a piece of ear there. Small reminders that luck had a price and that price had a body. It wasn't always violence. Some men lost their voice, not from knives, but from fear. A bad debt followed home didn't always strike immediately. It waited. It circled. It asked questions in the night, until the man who owed simply stopped speaking altogether. Worse still were those who lost something larger. A name, for instance. A man who owed too much might find himself unable to use his own again. He'd be known only by what he'd done, or what he'd failed to do. The ower, they'd call him, or half-hand, or borrowed mouth. And when a name dies, so does a man's place in the world. Others lost freedom more directly. They were told to work it off, behind the tavern, under the floor, in another part of town where people didn't ask questions and didn't leave when the work was done. These debts didn't come with contracts. They came with nods. And once accepted, they didn't end until the house said so. Some never ended at all. A man might spend the rest of his life serving drinks in the same room where he once wagered everything, invisible and quiet, carrying mugs to players who didn't know he'd once been one of them. And yet, men kept playing, even after seeing what loss could mean, even after watching someone carried out by the ankles or silenced with a broken jaw. Because in the heat of the moment, in the glow of the torchlight and the roar of the table, the risk didn't feel real. Not until it was. Not until the dealer leaned in and said the coin wasn't enough. Not until the hand was held down. Not until the man realized that the worst thing he could lose in this room wasn't money. It was the illusion that only money was at stake. In the medieval casino, every bet carried more than it claimed. Every roll whispered a possibility worse than zero. And every player, whether they admitted it or not, knew. The house didn't just want your coin. It wanted what came after. And it almost always got it. There always came a point when the coins stopped clinking. When the purse lay open on the table, limp and empty, and the silence stretched longer than it should. That was the moment everything changed. Because the game didn't end when the money did. Not here. In the medieval casino, there was always something else to wager. A belt, a ring, a knife, a pair of boots, even the shirt on your back. Players who ran dry didn't leave. They leaned in. They bartered. They asked what else might count. And the room, never merciful, always answered, everything. Everything counted. A man could peel off his cloak, set it down with shaking fingers, and call it a bet. If it was worth enough, the dice rolled again. If not, the eyes around him narrowed, waiting to see what else he might offer. The air thickened, the sweat rose, and the man began to consider things he once swore he never would. Clothing was only the beginning. Once the outer layers were gone, the stakes turned stranger. A token from a lover, a promise of labor, a favor from someone not present. Some gambled the right to a future, a task owed, a day's work unpaid, a message delivered without question. Others offered names, connections, a debt transferred from one family to another, and when even that wasn't enough, they reached deeper. Some wagered their own freedom, not as a metaphor, but as a contract. One night's loss could bind a man to another for months. He might be taken into service, passed off to someone else, or held in the back of the house until he was useful. These weren't idle threats. The house remembered. And when debts became flesh, they were tracked like livestock, not out of cruelty, but because there was value to collect. Sometimes the wager wasn't the man himself, but someone he knew, a brother, a wife, a daughter. Spoken quickly, carelessly, as a bluff or a prayer, but accepted all the same. The house never asked whether the person in question had agreed. It simply nodded, marked it down, and let the dice fall. And if the roll failed, the consequence followed. A girl might be taken in the night, a boy called into service, a wife sold into a contract she couldn't read. No one stopped it. No one asked whether it was fair. Because fairness had nothing to do with this place. It was about hunger, about need, about the belief that something, anything, could be used to stay in the game a little longer. Even if that meant offering someone else's skin when yours was already worn thin. And still, it kept happening. Not because men were heartless, but because the room was. It warped their sense of scale. It made one more roll seem worth everything. And by the time they noticed what they'd promised, it was already too late. The debt had been recorded, not on parchment, but in eyes, in silence. In the subtle way the dealer stopped asking questions. A man might walk home with fewer clothes, fewer options, fewer names he could say aloud. But the worst part was knowing that next time, he might bring less. That the line between what was his and what could be taken had already blurred. In the medieval casino, debt didn't end with coin. It slipped under your skin. It followed your family. It sat with you at breakfast. And sometimes, it looked you in the eye across the table, wearing the same cloak you once lost, smiling like it never belonged to you at all. Some nights, it happened without a sound. A hand on a shoulder. A glance. A quiet nod from someone no one ever seemed to notice entering. The man would stand, or not, and follow, or be lifted, or dragged just slightly, not enough to draw attention. A door at the back, or one behind the curtain. A shift in the air, a flicker in the candlelight. And then he was gone. The chair remained empty for a while. The table rearranged itself. No one asked where he went. No one looked around. The game continued. Dice rolled. Wine flowed. Conversations resumed. not out of ignorance but out of custom. Because in this place, disappearance wasn't rare. It was part of the rhythm, a necessary correction. The room couldn't breathe if it held on to everyone. Some had to be let out, or let go. Other nights it was louder. A crash, a yell, a struggle so fast it barely made sense. A man lifted by his collar, or struck before he could finish a sentence. A table flipped, a knife drawn and quickly hidden again. Eyes looked, but only briefly. The space around the event seemed to bend, widening just enough for it to happen without resistance. The crowd parted, but not like a wave, more like a ripple under pressure. Some backed away, others leaned in, pretending not to, and as the scuffle moved, to the door, to the alley, to the floor, the noise of the room swelled to cover it. Voices rose, laughter sharpened. Someone started another round. The game didn't pause. If anything, it accelerated, because acknowledging the removal would mean recognizing its purpose, and no one wanted to do that. Not here, not now. There were many reasons someone might be taken. A debt unpaid too long, a loss that wasn't accepted with the right posture, a bluff pushed too far, a whisper passed to the wrong ears. Sometimes it wasn't even clear. A man could be winning one moment, and the next moment he wasn't there. No explanation, no farewell, just an absence. The room held on to those moments with the same quiet reverence it gave to the dice. It didn't gossip. It didn't speculate. It simply absorbed the loss and moved on. Some said the ones who vanished went to the cellar. Others said the woods. Others said they came back, changed, as workers, as watchers, as men who no longer played. Whatever the truth, it didn't matter. What mattered was that everyone knew it could happen, and that pretending not to see it was the same as agreeing to stay. And so, the rule became silence. Eyes forward, hands on the table. If someone left, they left. If someone fell, they fell. And if someone was dragged out beneath a bench, leaving a trail that would be mopped up before dawn, the best you could do was not follow with your gaze. The room taught this lesson early. Hesitate, and you'd be noticed. Ask, and you might be next. So players learned to absorb the noise without flinching, to keep their drink raised even as footsteps echoed behind them. It wasn't cowardice. It was instinct. Because in the medieval casino, survival depended not on strength or luck alone, but on knowing when to stay quiet, when to keep your head down, and when to let the missing stay missing, unnamed, unmentioned, unremembered. They didn't come often, and when they did, no one looked relieved. There was no cheering, no shifting of shoulders in gratitude, no calls for help. The arrival of the guards meant one thing and one thing only. It was time to pay. Not for safety, not for justice, not for peace, but for the privilege of existing. They didn't wear the bright colors of patrol, nor carry the polished weapons used for ceremony. Their boots were quiet. Their eyes didn't wander. They entered without speaking, moved without being stopped, and walked directly to the man behind the table or the man behind the door. A few words, never loud. A pouch exchanged. A nod. Then they were gone. No one counted what they took. No one dared. It was understood. This wasn't protection. It was tax. And in the medieval casino, tax came with a face and a sword. They never intervened. Fights broke out, knives were drawn, men disappeared under benches. None of it moved the guards. That wasn't their concern. Their job wasn't to keep the room safe, it was to keep it running. So long as the blood didn't spill into the street, so long as the torches outside still burned and the gold still moved, the law stayed quiet. The guards didn't take sides, didn't care who won or lost, didn't glance twice at a broken nose or a missing hand. What mattered was the share, the cut, the understanding that a place like this couldn't exist without them, and wouldn't be allowed to if it stopped paying. The house knew that. The players knew that. Everyone knew that, which made their presence less of a threat and more of a ritual. An exchange, a performance with only one ending. Sometimes the payment was money, a set amount, fixed by habit more than agreement. Other times it was something else, a bottle, a promise, a favor owed later, unnamed and unscheduled. On rare occasions, the guards asked for someone, a man who'd said too much, a man who owed the wrong kind of debt. And when they did, no one argued. The man was handed over, no struggle, no defense, because this too was part of the cost. To operate without interruption, the house had to give something back, not often. Just enough to remind the room who really controlled the walls. The guards didn't smile. They didn't threaten. They didn't stay longer than they had to. And when they left, the room exhaled. Not in relief, but in acknowledgement. A weight paid. A balance kept. Until next time. No one hated them. Hatred took effort. And effort meant you believed something might change. But in the medieval casino, nothing changed. The guards came, the house paid, the game resumed. Some even welcomed it. The logic was simple. So long as they were collecting, they weren't burning it down. So long as they were taking coin, they weren't taking lives. And for a place that lived in the shadow of law, but outside its reach, that was worth the price. Even if the price rose. Even if the faces behind the helmets changed. Even if one day, the pouch felt lighter than usual, and the glance from across the table lasted too long. Because in the end, the guards didn't care about the rules. Only the rhythm. Only the cut. And in this room, everything, from the coin to the silence, existed to make sure they kept getting both. There were nights when no one screamed, when no one was thrown against the wall, when no table was overturned, when no blade flicked loose beneath the torchlight. They were rare. So rare, in fact, that people noticed them, whispered about them. Quiet tonight, someone might mutter, eyes scanning the room like it had a mind of its own. And it did. Because silence here wasn't peace. It was tension waiting for breath. Nights without blood didn't feel safer. They felt wrong. Like something was being held back. Like the pressure hadn't disappeared, but simply thickened beneath the surface. And everyone knew what that meant. If it didn't spill tonight, it would spill soon. Maybe bigger, maybe worse. Maybe from someone who had never raised their voice before. In this place, calm was just the step before the break. But most nights followed the rhythm. Low grumbles, rising voices, the slap of a hand against wood, and then the shift. The part where words stopped working. Maybe a dice roll went too well, or too poorly. Maybe someone laughed too hard at the wrong man. Maybe a hand brushed a purse without permission. It didn't take much. An insult misheard. A stare held a second too long. Even winning too quickly could be enough. The kind of luck that others read as mockery. And once the tension snapped, there was no going back. Chairs scraped, drinks spilled. Someone stood. And then the sounds. Fists on bone, boots on ribs, the dull crunch of something softer than wood giving way. It didn't last long. Fights never did here. They weren't about dominance. They were about release, about restoring balance to a room that hated stillness. And when the violence passed, the room absorbed it like water into dirt. Someone would mop up the blood with an old cloth, toss it behind the bar, and replace the mug that had been broken. The players shifted back into place. New coins appeared. A fresh game began. No one asked if the man who'd been knocked out was breathing. If he got up, he got up. If he didn't, someone else took his seat. The house didn't get involved, not unless the fight reached the walls. And even then, its response was more about preserving the room than protecting the people in it. There was no punishment, just a thinning of tolerance, a shared glance, a promise that next time, it might not end with just a bruise. But even that didn't stop it. Because in this place, pain wasn't a warning. It was part of the cost. What never failed, though, were the threats. Every night carried them like smoke in the rafters. Soft-spoken ones, spat between clenched teeth. Loud, theatrical ones, meant to humiliate more than wound. Some were promises. I'll find you later. Others were simple declarations. You've made a mistake. No night passed without them. Even the quietest games carried tension in the way players leaned forward, in how tightly mugs were gripped. Every man assumed the other might break, might snap, might decide that coin wasn't enough, and only blood could settle the debt. And most of the time, it stopped there. Most of the time, the threat was enough. But that's why the nights without blood felt so strange. Because the threat was always there, always spoken, always meant. And in a place where nothing was forgotten, all it took was one lost round too many to turn a whisper into a scream. The light comes slowly, but when it does, it changes everything. Not like a torch, sudden and harsh, but soft, indifferent. It slips through the cracks in the shutters, seeps under the door, catches the floating dust in the air, and with it, the room begins to unravel. The laughter, once loud enough to shake the ceiling beams, fades to mutters. The curses stop carrying teeth. The dice fall quieter, as if ashamed to still be rolling. Players who had once leaned forward now slump back, lips dry, eyes unfocused, hands resting on empty tables. The torches flicker low, their smoke curling lazily into the morning. The room, once alive with noise and tension, becomes still. Not peaceful. Never that. Just empty. Like a feast after the food is gone. Like a stage when the actors forget their lines. The tables are the first to show the damage. Sticky with spilled ale and blood not fully wiped away. Coins long vanished, but the dents remain. Pressed deep into the wood by fists, mugs, desperation. Crumbs cling to the edges. Wax has pooled in forgotten corners. A bent chair sits off to the side like it's been exiled. The smell thickens in the quiet. What was once hidden by noise and sweat and motion now hangs heavy in the air. Sour drink, burnt oil, rotting meat, something metallic beneath it all. There's a kind of sadness in the mess, but also truth. The glamour, if it ever existed, is gone. What remains is raw and bare, nothing but the bones of the night. And no one wants to look too closely, so they don't. They shuffle toward the door, clutching what's left of their coin or their pride, and leave without speaking. The ones who stay do not stay by choice. They're the ones too drunk to stand, too bruised to move, too broken to pretend they'll be fine. Some sleep with their heads on the table, arms curled tight like children. Others stare at nothing, lips moving in silent conversation with ghosts that won't let them rest. No one wakes them. No one asks. The dealer counts what little is left behind. A bent token, a cracked mug, a glove with no partner, and says nothing. The staff sweeps around the bodies like furniture. It's routine now. The house prepares for silence the way others prepare for guests. Buckets come out. Rags are dunked in sour water. And still, the sun keeps rising, careless and uninvited, touching the faces of those who once believed the night would never end. By the time the cocks crow, the illusion has collapsed. Whatever masks had been worn, of wealth, of luck, of control, lie scattered like cards left in a losing hand. No one leaves proud. Even the winners look smaller in daylight. Their silver shines less. Their voices crack. Their hands shake. The casino doesn't close, but it empties itself, like a lung exhaling everything rotten. The last to go are the ones who know they'll be back. They walk slowly, heads down, already counting what they'll bring next time. Behind them, the room settles into its truest form. Quiet, stained, heavy. The torches are out. The tables are bare. And the silence, at last, is honest. Because in the medieval casino, night hides everything. But morning? Morning shows what's left. And most of the time, it isn't much. They say the house always wins. But what of the man who walks away with pockets full and eyes bright? He leaves before the sun, before the room exhales its smoke and regret. He moves quickly, as if chased, not by guards or gamblers, but by the knowledge that luck is never loyal. There is no celebration. No one claps his back. No one asks his name. Perhaps they did once, years ago, before they learned. But in places like this, memory is a luxury few can afford. Winning is not a story to be told. It's a secret, tight as a coin in a clenched fist. Because the man who wins too loudly tends to vanish just as loudly, and not in the way he hoped. There are stories, of course, always are. Some say the lucky ones bought land, or paid off old debts, or fled to towns where no one asked questions. Others say they ended up back at the table, double or nothing, then nothing again. The truth? No one really knows, because no one really cares. The house doesn't keep portraits. The walls don't honor champions. A man might win a small fortune, but he doesn't become a legend. Not here. He becomes a rumor, a ghost with a name no one repeats, and in time even that fades. All that remains is the shape of the seat he sat in, and someone else fills it soon enough. What people remember are the ones who lost, the loud ones, the bloody ones, the desperate and the foolish, the man who screamed, the man who wept, the man who tried to cheat and didn't make it to the door. These are the stories that stick, not because they're noble, but because they're warnings. The winner? He doesn't leave a mark. He doesn't carve his initials into the table. He doesn't shout goodbye. He slips into the morning like mist, unremarked, unmissed. And maybe that's what he wants. Maybe anonymity is the only prize worth having. But it's lonely too. quiet, hollow. So the room forgets him. The dealer forgets. The girl with the wine forgets. The boy who swept under his chair forgets. And that's the cost of winning here. Silence. No songs, no statues, no stories. Just another night. Another hand. Another man with a little more luck and a little less time. And eventually, even he forgets what it felt like to walk out with more than he came in with. Because in the end, the house remembers nothing, and neither does anyone else. Even when the walls collapse and the roof caves in, the casino doesn't vanish. The wood might rot, the doors might be torn away by wind and time, but the place, the idea of it, stays. It clings to the cobblestones like grease. It lingers in the air like smoke no one lit. No one has to say its name. They just glance, lower their voice, change the subject. They say, that building used to be something, and leave it there. Because everyone knows, not just what it was, but what it still is, even if there's nothing left to see. You can burn the chairs and sweep away the bones, but the feeling never leaves. The luck and the loss and the lies, they sink into the dirt. Years later, someone builds a shop there, or a stable, or maybe a chapel. But strange things happen. Coins go missing. People stay too long. A young man brings a set of dice just for fun, just to pass time. And before long, others gather. They say it's harmless. They say it's tradition. They say they're not gambling, just playing. But the rules are the same. The circle closes. The air thickens. The place remembers. And so do the people, even if they pretend not to. They tell stories of uncles who lost everything, or grandmothers who warned them not to step too close. And those stories pass like whispers until they settle into habits. Habits become rituals. Rituals become rooms. And the game begins again. It doesn't need a name. It doesn't need a sign. The casino lives in the twitch of a gambler's hand, in the hush that falls when the coin spins, in the glance toward a building that's no longer there. It exists in the way a man leans too far forward, or how he hides his winnings in his boot. It lives in the guilt of a man walking home with nothing, and in the smug silence of another who doesn't yet realize he's next. The place lives on because it never needed permission. It was never about the walls or the rules. It was about the pull, the rush of risk, the taste of chance. That doesn't burn. That doesn't fade. That simply waits. So even if the building's gone, even if the street has a new name and the people walk faster, it's still there. In the way dust gathers on certain steps, in the way no one makes eye contact near the corner, in the way old men pause before turning in. The casino remains. Maybe not with dice or cards, maybe not with blood or shouting, but in the quiet thought that someone, somewhere, is always willing to play, always willing to lose, always willing to believe this time will be different. And that belief, that's what keeps the place alive, long after the fire, long after the stones are gone, long after anyone remembers how it really was. That was the world behind the curtains, where luck ruled louder than law, and silence meant more than confession. A place built not of stone, but of risk and need, and the soft sound of coins changing hands in the dark. Now you know what the casino really was. Not a building, a rhythm, a weakness, a promise no one could keep. So now, let it fade. Let the noise die down. Let the tables clear and the dice come to rest. There'll be another story tomorrow. Another place, another time. Just as quiet, just as strange. But for now, close your eyes. Let it all drift away. Good night.